Hello and welcome to the second section of Topic 2.2, Communities and Ecosystems. In this section, we're going to change our focus a little bit. In this section, we're going to look at those feeding relationships and how those feeding relationships can be modelled using food chains, food webs and pyramids. So, just to recap a little bit. In the last section, you saw this slide. So, ecosystems have a hierarchy, and energy flows in the ecosystem are illustrated within this food chain, and the arrows illustrate the flow of energy. Though food chains are actually a very, very oversimplification of quite a complex system, they only show feeding relationships in one direction. And some organisms can be in more than one direction, in one level of the food chain, in one level of the system. The illustration we've got in this slide is from the Arctic ecosystem, which we've seen in a few other presentations. So lemons eat cotton grass. Cotton grass are the primary producers, and lemons are the primary consumers in this food chain. And the wolf eats the lemon, so they're the secondary consumer. Though the reality is somewhat more complex. So, if we look at all of the food chains that the lemon is in, you can actually see that the lemon's in a couple of different places within the food chain. In the first one illustrated at the top, the lemon is actually the secondary consumer. It's eating insects that have eaten the cotton grass. But in the other two, the lemon's actually eaten by two different species, by snowy owls and both wolves. So, trying to use food chains to explain the feeding relationships would lead us to long lists of food chains. So how do ecologists get over the problems of this? Well, what ecologists do is they actually develop food chains into food webs. And as you can see from this diagram, this illustration, the left-hand part of the illustration is actually showing the individual food chains that we've just looked at. So starting with cotton grass, we've got insects eating the cotton grass, and we've got lemons eating the cotton grass. But the lemons also eat the insect. And then we've got snowy owl, and we've got the wolf eating the lemons. But we've also got a second part in it. We've got another component to the feeding relationships in this ecosystem. That we've got the reindeer eating lichen, and the reindeer themselves being eaten by the wolf. So it's more complex than the individual food chains show us. And the advantage of the food web is it actually shows this complexity of connections much better than the food chain was showing us. So as individual models, the food chain is concentrating on stepwise energy flow, whereas the food web is actually looking at the system level. The food web, though, is still dependent on the sampling that an ecologist has done to actually know what organisms there are in the ecosystem and what feeding relationships exist between them. And quite often, many textbooks leave out two important components of an entire food web. In this illustration, you can see that I've added fungus to represent decomposers and a mosquito to represent parasites in the ecosystem. Eventually, all matter that isn't eaten by something else becomes material that will decompose in the system. So there's arrows there coming from the wolf, the lemon, cotton grass, lichen and reindeer. But there should also be arrows coming from the mosquito, coming from the insects and also coming from the snowy owl. And then when we look at the parasite, the mosquito in it, well, the mosquito is feeding on the blood of the wolf and the reindeer, and most likely on the lemons and on the snowy owls. I could easily have added arrows coming from the lemon and the snowy owl to the mosquito, but I just didn't want to make the diagram even more messed up and chaotic than it is already. So why might many textbooks actually leave out the decomposers and the parasites? Does that really say something about problems with food chains as a model? And food webs as a model? To answer higher order questions on the exam paper, you need to actually think about the limitations of both food chains and food webs. And even food webs have their limitations. One of their biggest limitations is they totally depend on how much sampling has been done in an ecosystem. If the ecosystem is unknown, we don't know what organisms are there and what's eating what. And the more diverse an ecosystem is, the greater the number of connections inside any food web. So I can illustrate this here in terms of a coral reef. So coral reef is quite a diverse system, and even this is a very simplified food web of a coral reef. So these are quite descriptive models, but their quality in allowing us to understand totally depends on how many connections we've actually managed to make. The other disadvantage of both chains and webs is that they're only a descriptive model. They're not really telling us anything about how much energy is moving. They're only telling us where the energy is moving to and from. So in reality, they are quite a simplification, and they're really just a qualitative model. The QR code there will take you to some more information about food webs and food chains. So it might be worth looking up, yeah? So, food webs say nothing about the number of organisms at each trophic level. That's a limitation of them. Or the amount of energy stored and transferred between levels. They're only showing you the direction of energy flow and nothing more than that, and the connections within that energy flow. So, is there a better way of showing these energy relationships and the feeding relationships inside an ecosystem? One way that's been around for quite a long time is something called ecological pyramids. I think it was Elton in about 1921 that developed the first ecological pyramids. There's three different types of ecological pyramid, and we're going to look at each of them separately. The first one is pyramids of number. So here we have a pyramid of numbers for a grassland ecosystem. The ecosystem only samples 0.4 of a hectare. But as you can see, at the first trophic level, we've got over 5 million individual organisms. At the second trophic level, we've got about 700,000. The third trophic level, about 3,500,000. At the very top trophic level, we've only got 3 individuals. Yeah, so we can see it's creating a pyramid. One of the first thoughts should really be that it's very, very unlikely that the ecologist who was out sampling actually sampled over 5 million individual plant species. So looking at the producers in the first trophic level, well, it's reasonable to assume that that's actually an estimate based on smaller samples, something we'll look at later on. So we've got these pyramid of numbers that tell us something about the numbers of organisms at each trophic level. Again, they're limited, and one of the limitations that we have with them is when we try to use them with ecosystems that might be based around forests. So if you look at this one, this is a temperate forest ecosystem. Our first trophic level, we've only got 200 organisms. So again, it's a forest ecosystem, so they must be big trees. And at the second trophic level, we've got 150,000, third trophic level, 120,000. At the very top, we've only got 2 again. But this gives us an inverted pyramid, a pyramid that's actually upside down, that looks slightly wrong. So one of the weaknesses with pyramids of number is that they take no account of the size of the organism. They're only dealing just in definite numbers. So that is a weakness for a number of reasons. It's not really telling us very, very much directly about the energy in the system. It's only telling us about the number of organisms. However, there is another level of detail that we could look at. Instead of actually just counting individual organisms, we could actually look at the biomass. And biomass is an estimation of the dried mass in grams per meter squared of all the organisms at each trophic level. So it depends much less on counting individual organisms, but it does depend on sampling organisms. And well, if we're going to get dry mass, that would probably mean that for animals, we're actually going to have to kill them or get some meat and dry it out to actually find out what the mass is. That might be a limitation in some situations. There are ways scientists get around that, and we'll actually discuss that a little bit later. So if you look at this one for the biomass of a lake in the USA, well, around about 100 grams per square meter in the producers, about 10 grams per square meter in the primary consumers, and in the secondary consumers we've got about 2 grams per square meter. If you notice, so far all of these graphs are sort of showing a feeding relationship where the numbers get smaller as we go up through the pyramid. But again, there are problems with some of these ecological pyramids and biomass pyramids. So again, this is for the same lake in the USA, but it's actually at a different time of year. And therefore, the actual productivity is very, very low. The actual amount of growth that's happening. So the biomass of the producers is very, very small. And that's obviously affected the biomass of the first trophic level. Looking at the number differences, we can possibly assume that that might be overwintering birds. So one of the weaknesses that pyramids of biomass have is that they actually only take account at the time when the sample was made. So they have problems with seasonality in some places, and this one obviously is showing that. It's the same lake, and we've got very, very different pyramids because it was taken at different times of the year. So that's really not telling us very much about the energy in the system. And there's a third type of pyramid that's much better at actually doing this, which obviously, if we're looking at energy in the ecosystem, we may as well have pyramids of the energy that's actually there. The nice thing about pyramids of energy within the ecosystem, you can actually take account of decomposition. So if you look at this pyramid, it's got a block actually on the side of it as well, which is for decomposers. And pyramids of energy measure energy in terms of either grams per meter squared per year, and grams, in this case, we're really talking about grams of carbon, or in joules per meter squared. And it represents the productivity. We're actually talking about how productive a system is. So this one again is from Silver Springs catchment in the USA. Both Eugene Odom and Howard Odom did a lot of study work on this catchment in Florida, and it created a set of really, really famous thoughts on energy inside systems. And a lot of our thinking in ecology, environmental sciences is very much based around a lot of the work inside this. If you can have a read of a copy of this, it's actually quite fascinating. A little bit out of date in terms of its style, but it's quite a nice piece to read through if you persevere with it. Okay, so what are pyramids really, really showing us about energy in an ecosystem? Well, if you think back to topic 1, we looked at the second law of thermodynamics. And the second law of thermodynamics talks about the movement towards entropy. And what these are really showing is that the food chains are actually showing that both the number, biomass and energy actually decreases as we go further up the food chain. And if you think back to the last section, well, we've got losses of energy in terms of heat of respiration, but we've also got losses of energy in terms of things that can't get passed on, material that isn't entering the feeding system, which is where the representation for decomposition in the pyramid of energy is actually quite important. Okay, I've just noticed that there's a mistake actually in this slide. It should say pyramids of energy resolve these. So both pyramids of number and biomass often contain anomalies. That's what we've looked at, where they're inverted, where they're upside down. But pyramids of energy actually resolve this. Pyramids of energy are always going to be pyramid shaped because they're showing the amount of energy actually being passed on between each stage, each trophic level. So let's summarize in terms of advantages and disadvantages. So, pyramids of number. Advantages of them, they're a very simple overview and can be good at comparing changes in population numbers over time or season. So you use them for sampling at different times of the year. You get quite interesting patterns. Obviously, if you were sampling an estuary in the northern hemisphere in the winter, you'd get much fewer ducks and geese, etc., feeding at that time of year than you would in the spring and summer. So the pyramids of number are going to be very, very different. Disadvantages is that all organisms are included regardless of their size. It takes no account about the contribution that each organism is making to the ecosystem. So a single tree counts the same as a single grass plant. Also, they don't usually allow for juveniles and immature forms. Quite often they're not sampled and counted in just number counts that ecologists take of ecosystems. And the other problem that you could have is that numbers can be too great to represent accurately. So if you were trying to do this for a very, very big grassland area, the numbers of individual grass species are just so great compared to much smaller numbers of, say, zebra, if we go back to our example of the African savanna. So that's the advantages and disadvantages of pyramids of number. So what about biomass? Well, biomass overcomes most of the problems that pyramids of number have, but they use samples of populations. So it's impossible to measure biomass exactly. Some of the problems in that is that for some species, we actually don't have real measures of biomass. We have to estimate this based on comparison. So for instance, we compare a water buffalo with the biomass of a cow. We can actually do measurements of biomass quite easily on beef, but we wouldn't want to do measurements of biomass on water buffalo in say the Serengeti in Africa. Also, the time of year that the biomass is measured affects the results. Similar sort of problem to within pyramids of numbers that I just talked about, but in pyramids of numbers it can be an advantage. If we're really looking at the biomass, we've got to look at the biomass across the entire year, and it continually changes in some ecosystems, especially ecosystems that have migration in and out of them. So that's a problem, and it doesn't take account of short-lived, highly productive organisms very well. So organisms, especially ones that are based on lakes and seas, that are really based on phytoplankton, plant plankton, where you get very, very rapid turnover, where the plankton don't live for very long, but there's thousands and thousands of them being replaced each day. They're highly productive, but in terms of biomass, they're actually quite small. So that's quite a problem with ecological pyramids for biomass. And finally, what about pyramids of energy? Well, they're the most accurate system to show the actual energy transfer, and they allow for rates of production. The disadvantage with them is they're difficult and complex to collect data for. Often they use representative samples, as I've just talked about. It's very, very difficult to measure the energy quality inside a chimpanzee, for instance. We're not going to take a chimpanzee, kill it, to then dry its meat out, to then actually incinerate it to measure how much energy is being given out from its meat. So we have to use estimates of similar organisms. So in terms of the actual numbers for them, they're just an estimate, and you've always got to remember that. But in terms of an overview for an entire trophic level, they're actually quite a good way of showing what's happening to the energy within inside it. Okay, so again, there's a QR code on each of these pages. This is a different QR code which will take you to another set of more detailed notes about ecological pyramids. So that's it for this third section of topic 2.2. It's quite a long topic, so there's going to be another section to follow. And thinking about ATL skills and research, the citations for the work that I use, all the diagrams that I redrew are based on Eugene Odum's Fundamentals of Ecology, and the 1959 version. It's been updated. 1959 version, I think, is the second edition. I think it's now in edition 6 or 7. But if you can actually get a copy of it, there's a copy in your library. It's actually still quite a good read. And some extended resources and further reading. Again, Odum's work on Silver Springs catchment is always worth going to look at, and the link there takes you to a nice overview of it. And also, I've put a link into a PBS page with a really, really nice short little video that shows energy flow through a coral reef ecosystem. Okay, so stay tuned for section 3 of this. Many thanks, and that's it.